Welcome to Aspen Leading Edge. Today's guest is Beth Burch. She is the Fuller E. Callaway Chair of Law at the University of Georgia School of Law. Welcome, Professor Burch.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I'm excited too because I know you are an expert on mass torts. You have written 2 seminal academic books, Mass Tort Deals, Backroom Bargaining and Multi-District Litigation, Cambridge 2019, and The Law of Class Actions and Other Aggregate Litigation, 2020 through Foundation Press. But now you have authored something totally different than an academic book or a case book. And so I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about why you started the process of writing The Pain Brokers, how con men, call centers, and rogue doctors fuel America's lawsuit factory. And that's through Atria One Signal Publishers 2026. So how does a law professor end up writing a book like that?
Yeah, well, I actually started writing this in part because I was frustrated with how plaintiffs were treated within the mass tort system. So I did a procedural justice study right before COVID hit, continuing through COVID, where we were talking to plaintiffs who were involved in these types of women health mass torts like pelvic mesh and, going all the way back to, say, talc and Dalcon Shield and all these, whether it's a birth device or whether it's a medical implant like mesh, and talking to them about how they felt like the justice system treated them. And what I heard over and over again was that they didn't feel like their lawyers were really listening to them. They felt like a number on a spreadsheet. So I think a lot of people, when they encounter the legal system, they think, I'm going in, I'm going to have my day in court, I'm going to have my Perry Mason or my Matlock moment or whatever it might be. And they get into the process and they really do just feel like they are part of a system, part of a machine. They don't have an opportunity to tell their story. That's very frustrating for them. And so the more I got into this, the more I thought, I could write the same article that I wrote back in 2004 today, and it would have the same resonance or maybe lack thereof. And so I got frustrated about that because so little has changed in the 20 plus years that I have been writing about this. And so I decided to go back to school. I got a fellowship from my provost. I entered our MFA program through Grady School of Journalism here at UGA, and I got an MFA in narrative nonfiction. And I learned how to tell, a story, a true story, a story about mass torts, but for a much broader audience in hopes that maybe something would change. Maybe we could talk about this on a bigger scale rather than just among academics or among practitioners in the field who have very little incentive to change because they're beneficiaries of the status quo.
So there's so much I'd like to peel back there before we start talking about the pain brokers in particular. So you said so much hasn't changed since 2004 when you wrote an article. That article, was it just about women in mass torts? Was it just about mass torts and plaintiffs? What was the article in 2004?
Yeah, so I started writing in 2004 about the incentive structures of what's happening in multi-district litigation, or MDLs as they are known for short. Essentially, when I explain it to my students, an MDL can be a certified class. So MDLs are for employment litigation or intellectual property or securities. But what we tend to hear about them happening most is in the mass tort context. So MDLs and mass torts include things like the BP oil spill or the opiate litigation or the Vioxx cases or now the GLP-1 lawsuits over Ozempic and Wegovy. And those tend to be the most public-facing types of cases. And they are similar to class actions in that you have all of the principal agent problems that exist in the class action context, but they lack certification typically, at least in mass torts, through Rule 23. So Rule 23 class actions builds in some checklists, builds in some safeguards to make sure that the settlement is fair, reasonable, and adequate. Mass torts has all those problems minus the safeguards. So when I talk to my students about it, it's like this is the Wild West of litigation, and yet it is perhaps our most public-facing aspect of litigation. Back in 2023, when the 3M military earplug cases were getting going, 1 out of every 2 new civil lawsuits filed in federal court was part of an MDL. So it is very public-facing, and I think the way our citizens think about the legitimacy of the courts is often influenced through these types of mass torts.
Now, I don't have any experience with mass torts myself, thankfully, but I do, for these class actions. I get these little postcards. I have one on my counter at home. I don't even know what class action it was for, but I'm part of the class and I'm going to get some sort of settlement that might be $1.99 on a Visa card, right? So you're saying that those class actions have a lot of safeguards. For the mass torts, is each individual plaintiff heard on the merits, or is it a big settlement like these class actions, and then each plaintiff gets, the $2,500 that each plaintiff gets? How does that work?
So it is a little bit different. Class actions, are really designed in part to deal with small claims litigation. So you can imagine that you're overcharged $3 at your ATM. No attorney is going to take your case unless there are millions of you. The other part that I would just sort of draw a distinction between is that it's not very personal to the holder. I don't much care if I get that $3 back. I don't have a significant stake in whether lawyers get fees on that and whether I get some return. Any return that I get is going to be a good thing. It's very different when we're talking about mass torts. Mass torts tend to be personal injury litigation on steroids. So it's not just a single car accident victim or a whiplash victim. These are people who alleged grievous wrongs, oftentimes against big pharma or against some sort of big corporation, and they are personal to the holder. So the women that I write about in The Pain Brokers were all victims of pelvic mesh, which was a product that was designed to deal with urinary incontinence or pelvic organ prolapse. It ended up being recalled by the FDA many years later for pelvic organ prolapse, but it's a product that can unravel within people. So not a great product, but again, different than a class action and much more personal to the people who are the victims.
So what alerted you that this particular mass tort, this procedure that has gone wrong for many women, was something that was worth digging into and writing about?
Well, as I mentioned, this procedural justice study that I did was what first brought me into contact with the women. And then I really wanted to write a story for the general public. And I wanted it to be a page turner, something that people would be excited about reading, something that, reads like fiction, but is absolutely true. And about a month and a half into my MFA program, I got a phone call from a whistleblower, and he told me this story that was so crazy and so fantastical that I thought, there's no way that this is true. This is one of these kind of whack jobs out there. And I started digging into it, and I don't know that I would have had I not been in the MFA program. But the more I dug, the more I realized that this is absolutely true, and it's absolutely a story that needs to be told. And the villains are just so villainous. I mean, you can't even begin to make up some of these people. And so it was really fascinating for me to be able to dive in and to write about this type of a scam.
So do you mind sharing in general terms, because we want people to buy the book? It sounds like it would be like a civil action. I remember that book was a real page turner, but about real circumstances. What did the whistleblower allege was happening?
So by the way, I love a civil action. And it was, one of my touchstones for this book was trying to write something that was a modern version of a civil action. So what the whistleblower told me was essentially that there were people who were getting cold called. So imagine that you were in your kitchen, you get a call on either your landline or your cell phone, and the caller is somebody that you might normally hang up on, except that they know an inordinate amount of information about you. They know your name, they know your birthday, they know the date that you had mesh implanted, they know the name of your doctor, the name of your hospital. And so all of a sudden, something that seems like this could be kind of a crazy scam then becomes more legitimate because they know all of this information about you. And so it turns out that they were getting that information through a data breach in India as medical records were being outsourced to India for electronic records keeping. The companies there realized that they were sitting on a mass tort gold mine.
Oh my gosh.
And terrifying. So, yeah, I mean, and then they tell the women, you have a ticking time bomb in you. If you don't fly to South Florida within 2 weeks and have this removed, then you're going to die. And they had, different types of lines that they would feed to different people depending on the responses that they got. And the women in the book are all very different. Sharon Gore is from South Carolina. She has a master's degree. She's in charge of special education in Horry County, which is a huge conglomerate. Then Barb Shepard is up in New Jersey. She has a high school diploma. She's working 2 jobs. She's a school bus driver for the kids up there and also works at a plastics manufacturer. And then Jerry Plummer is in Arkansas when she gets this, and she makes the mistake of answering the phone call while she's sitting on the bed with her granddaughter. And her granddaughter overhears this and thinks my grandmother's going to die, and then becomes this unwitting accomplice and trying to convince Jerry to fly down to South Florida to have her mesh removed. So the women fly down to South Florida. They sign this DocuSign packet, which, I think we've all probably signed DocuSign at some point along the way. And it's programmed to automatically go to the signature page and to auto-populate their initials throughout the entire document. So they thought they were signing health insurance forms, consent to surgery, HIPAA, and it turns out there were liens in there, so medical liens. So a procedure that would have cost them between $800 and $1,000 had they gone through their insurance company ended up costing between $69,000 and $150,000 as liens against their future settlement proceeds.
Oh my gosh.
It's just crazy. They hired an attorney through this packet. There was an attorney-client retainer agreement in there. So the women were flown to South Florida, and instead of being flown to a hospital, they were flown to this outpatient center owned by chiropractors, or an outpatient center next to a strip mall. Their mesh was taken out. There were typically 5 of these done in a day. Now, done right, mesh removal can take between 7 and 8 hours each, but they were being ripped out 5 a day. One of the doctors bragged to me that she was taking them out in 15 minutes. This is a product that is meant to go in and form scar tissue around that area of the body and create a protective sort of shield. It's like rebar and concrete. It's meant to go in. It's never meant to come out. And so then they were put up at a hotel overnight and flown home the next day. That's kind of the basic outline. That's the beginning of the book, is them flying down to South Florida. And then, the book becomes this quest for justice. And will they be able to get some sort of justice in a system that is stacked against them? I should mention, too, that the scam ran in part because product that was removed meant a settlement value that was much, much higher for everyone but the women. So the doctors were getting rich, the middlemen were getting rich, the lawyers were getting rich, and the women were averaging $40,000 in the settlement before attorney's fees and costs. And the liens didn't even cover the whole amount. So in some cases, these lien holders actually went after the women for the remainder.
Oh my gosh. In every part of the story, there's a bad guy. I can't believe, you would think, okay, the attorneys do the women wrong, right? But in this case, even the doctors, the healthcare professionals are creating problems for the women on top of the attorneys instigating litigation that the women weren't aware of. And then these liens, oh my gosh, I'm excited to read the book, but how awful. So the whistleblower tells you that this stuff is happening. And does the mass tort litigation, it's now by the doctors that are part of the law firms that are claiming that the pelvic mesh implant was harmful and so pulled out, right? Is that kind of the theory?
Right. So the mesh was not a great product, but it didn't need to be removed in all cases. And so,
certainly not in 15 minutes. Yeah.
And certainly not in 15 minutes. And many of the women that were getting these cold calls had mesh inserted for stress urinary incontinence, which is still being used controversially for today. And many of the women in the book didn't actually need to have it removed. So mesh wasn't a great product, let's be clear on that, but it didn't always need to come out. And the women in the book were actually left much worse off for having had it removed, one of whom is now permanently incontinent and has been told by multiple doctors that there's nothing they can do for her.
Oh, it's so horrible. So the mesh, because of these cold calls and the people making the cold calls saying, this is dangerous, you could die, even those who were asymptomatic for whom the mesh might be working were subject to this scheme.
Yeah. And, the cold callers will say, well, are you having any pain doing this? Are you having any pain doing that? And, as we age, we all have some aches and pains. It could be from this. It could be from that. It could be because, I bent over and I stood up too fast and now I've pulled a muscle in my back. So they were talking about these pains that were very common and they were capitalizing on that. And the other piece of this is that I think a lot of women felt like their doctors were dismissive of their pain. So for women who genuinely were having mesh-related pains, their doctor wasn't recognizing it, and that made them, then much more vulnerable to a scam like this.
So how many women were targeted for the scam and had this mesh removed?
Over 100,000 women receive these phone calls.
Oh,
It's difficult to get a good number for how many people actually came down to South Florida. It was not just South Florida, it happened in Georgia as well. And actually, I think there was a doctor in Texas who was doing it as well. I don't profile him as much, but it's difficult to get good numbers. So I know at least 1 to 2,000, probably more, actually went through this kind of a mesh mill.
and now is there a second layer of mass tort? Like, do these victims of the mesh mill now have their own mesh or mass tort against these doctors and lawyers?
So that certainly becomes kind of the center of the book. There are two protagonists in the book. One is a young lawyer from Arkansas. The beginning of the book actually shows him in his first year torts class. So, I teach torts, I teach civil procedure. So he's in his torts class and he graduates. And one of the first cases that he takes is Jerry Plummer. And it talks a little bit about his decision-making process about, whether to pursue a big law career or to go into practice. And he ultimately joins his dad in his solo practice in Benton, Arkansas, and comes to represent Jerry Plummer, who helps to expose the whole scam. He comes across a defense lawyer's work. Barbara Bennis was representing American Medical Systems, which was a device maker, and she realized as she was starting to settle some of these claims that something isn't right. This is strange. We're getting really inflated damages here. Plus, they were getting phone calls from device makers saying, someone's cold calling these women, and these women think it's us, and we haven't divulged their data to anybody. How do we figure out what is going on? So JR is helped out by stumbling across all of the work that Barbara Bennis has done to uncover this. And the book is very much this page turner and, trying to chase down some of the villains at the heart of the story. And I should mention, the villains are like the most villainous villains you can imagine. There's a guy who was running an online pill mill in the early 2000s, and he goes to prison for 30 months. He gets out, and then he starts a puppy mill. And so he is then put back into prison because he's violated his probation. And then, of course, he gets out again. And what does he do? He discovers mass torts. And the things that they're buying based on the money that they're making from these women. We're talking about like platinum toe rings for mistresses and ox blood red alligator boots. It's a really crazy story.
So if I ask you if any of them were criminally prosecuted, am I giving away the ending? Because I don't want you to give away the ending.
Yeah, so I won't give away the ending. I will say there are elements of criminal law that are wrapped up in here. One of the hopes, I think, for the book is that it can do in some ways what a civil action did for legal education. For a long time, I used a civil action and civil procedure, and I'm working on a document packet that would accompany the pain brokers that for people that want to take a look at deposition transcripts or to see what these subpoenas look like or what a motion to quash looks like. They can really kind of get into the weeds, and criminal law and arbitration and certainly civil procedure and torts are all wrapped up in that.
Oh, that would be exciting to use this in the classroom. And the 3 women that you chose to follow, are they okay now?
They're not great. Like I said, 2 of them have had subsequent procedures to try to fix the fix of the fix. And one of them has been told that there is really nothing that they can do for her. And so, as I mentioned, she's been left permanently incontinent, has to wear diapers, is afraid to leave the house because she's afraid she's going to have an accident. And it's really changed her life. It means that she doesn't even want to go to the grocery store because she's worried that she's going to embarrass herself.
Oh, it's just so tragic. Now, do you think that this happened to women because doctors overall, and maybe attorneys in this instance, listen less to kind of the women problems that patients come in with?
I think that certainly plays a role in it. If women felt like they could trust their primary care physician or their OBGYN, then they might be less inclined to fall prey to a scam like this. But it's not the whole answer. I think in some instances, even when the women trusted their own physicians, the callers would say, well, this is something new. Most doctors don't know about this yet. There's only a few doctors in the country who are able to do this. Don't worry, we're going to get you down to see them. But your doctor probably doesn't know that this exists yet or that it's a problem. And for a long time, those same doctors were still touting mesh as the gold standard. So there was a little bit of truth to that. And there's a little bit of truth to any kind of good scam.
So you mentioned that there was a data breach of the health records in India. Were these calls originating from India or were they originating from the US?
I have heard conflicting stories on this. There's a lot of finger pointing that happens later on in the book. A lot of these calls, I suspect, were originating in South Florida. Some of them were originating in India and then being hot transferred into South Florida. But certainly a lot of this was happening stateside.
After the pain brokers, well, let me ask you this. Did you enjoy this process of writing kind of, it's not fiction, but a more page turner kind of book than law review articles and case books?
Absolutely. I mean, I think at some point in our career, we all want to do something a little bit different. And, I grew up, I always wanted to be a writer as a little kid. I loved mysteries and Nancy Drew and Agatha Christie and all of the above. And so this gave me a chance to do something different. And even though the subject matter was very, intense, I loved every minute of writing about it. I loved being able to talk to these people. I particularly appreciated them trusting me with their stories. And it's nice to be able to do something that people might actually read as opposed to, a handful of people in the field who may or may not read whatever law review article it is.
Well, I know I'm excited to read The Pain Brokers, and I want to congratulate you on its publication. There are a lot of lawyers out there that want to be John Grisham, right? Or the Scott Turow, people who write about law and are popular authors. Do you think that the MFA was something that really helped you? And is that something you'd recommend to lawyers or law professors interested in writing a book like this?
Yeah, absolutely. And not to just tout our program, but it is a low residency program, which was great. I mean, I happen to be in Athens, but even if you weren't in Athens, it's 1 week a year, 1 week a semester, and then it's remote. And after 20 years of writing in legalese, it did take a good bit of unlearning. And, we think we write for people who are in a general audience, and it turns out none of that makes any sense to anybody in the public. And it was really helpful, the mentoring that I got through the Grady MFA program. So if that's an aspiration for anyone who is watching, I would encourage them to apply and to go to a program like that.
Great. Now, what's on deck for you after the Pain Brokers? I mean, besides being a law professor and doing all the things you have to do as a law professor, do you have another book on your mind, a future story you hope to tell?
I do. I have been reporting on a book about Tom Girardi, who the name may ring a bell to some people, but he was the lawyer behind Erin Brockovich for the movie, and he was married to Erica Jane of The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. And it turns out that for several decades, he had been secretly embezzling money from his mass tort clients.
My goodness. Now that
writing about that. Yeah. I've been working on that story. It's also the story of another plaintiff's attorney, Jay Edelson, who partnered with him and ultimately outed him when he was co-counseling on the Lion Air crash back in 2018 in Indonesia. So it's a fascinating story. The more I dig, the more I find, and the more I learn. And it's been, again, just kind of a fascinating process.
And when might we see that next book?
Hard to say. I don't have a publisher for it yet. We're going to hopefully get one of those soon, fingers crossed. So hopefully in the next year or two.
Well, good luck with that, and good luck with The Pain Brokers. It's a fascinating but really tragic story, and I'm glad you're shining a light on it. You're right. It sounds almost nonsensical, fanciful, that it could never happen, but unfortunately it did. So before we conclude, I would love to ask you, as a law professor, what your predictions are for the future of legal education in the coming decade.
Yeah, I wish I had a crystal ball. I think a lot of the pillars of legal education will still be there, but it remains to be seen how things like AI will begin to change that, how that will change the legal profession, and how we'll need to adapt our students to prepare for the world as it is instead of, the world as it was. And, we're very much attuned to that and keeping our finger on the pulse of legal education and making sure that all of our students are prepared for real world practice.
Outstanding. Well, thank you so much, Beth Burch, Fuller E. Callaway Chair of Law at the University of Georgia School of Law and author of The Pain Brokers. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can listen to additional thought leaders in legal education on the Aspen Leading Edge webpage or on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks so much.